Introduction. The past decades, since the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the peaceful disintegration of the Soviet Union, have witnessed successive amazing surprises for economists. At that time, traditional economists have long considered natural resources as the leading indicator of wealth and the real guarantor of prosperity and increasing the wealth of nations. Still, modern history has definitely proved the failure of this perspective. The failure of the Russian theory in the economy was ratified, and the Chinese were finally convinced of this. China began its renaissance by studying the economics curricula at Harvard. Some eyes turned to Japan, the most dominant economic power in the 80s. Still, this superiority did not produce any genuine innovations to ensure that Japan dominated in the future. So why couldn't Russia or Japan and their ilk stay as leaders of the world economy? This is what the great economists will tell us most. Free and competitive market. Economics is a logical science. Often everyone agrees with politicians that economists do not bring happy news. Economists find themselves in an awkward situation. They do nothing but design models and convey their messages. So why are they getting all this blame? This melancholy dates back to the Middle Ages when theologians considered the fair price and the church's attitude to usury. And the goal of these theorizations was not how to increase wealth or production but knowledge of halal and haram. And this is what politicians and merchants found unimportant. The mercantilist approach for a while dominated the economy of world governments, where countries intervene to protect their producers, give gifts and monopolies based on loyalty and closeness to the ruling class, not based on the quality of products or competitiveness, and wealth is measured based on natural resources and precious metals owned by the state. This was precisely what Smith sought to completely demolish when he began writing his book The Wealth of Nations. Smith built his theory of how to increase the wealth of nations based on human motives. Governments should let everyone follow their personal interest, pursue selfishness to achieve their own goals, and with an open market and a fair competitive atmosphere, everyone is guaranteed that this invisible hand will adjust all those personal interests and make them in the interests of consumers. The free market alone does not guarantee a huge international wealth. Therefore, the second principle for Smith is the division of labor, and Smith believes that the division of labor enables companies to double their production, which increases the wealth of the nation. By allocating and dividing tasks, workers are able to focus on a specific skill and thus perform it more efficiently in less time. And if we transfer this principle to a more comprehensive scope by dividing tasks into different countries or markets, the theory becomes more efficient, as it is not only about production, but the breadth of markets and the competitiveness they target. But Smith is a moral philosopher before he was an economist. Smith warned about the stupidity and laziness that workers acquire from repeating the same specific operations over and over again. Today we can see the U.S. economy as an excellent example of Smith's theory, where the government has removed its control and support from the market and companies as much as possible, and by freeing American companies from government controls and entering the world of competitiveness in the free market, it ensures that they will be the guaranteed source of new innovations and be the first to open those markets as well, and thus those economies supported by their governments become subsidiaries of American companies and beneficiaries. Malthus the pessimist and his less pessimistic friend. The end of the 18th century promised humans a brighter future, and philosophers and scientists emphasized that vision and encouraged their citizens to reproduce, considering that these increasing numbers will help the growth of the economy in the future. The dream was brilliant and comfortable for those societies, and therefore the prophecy of the philosopher and economist Malthus was like a nightmare. He dispelled all those dreams, and the population is growing at the same rates. The gloomy future is the kindest that awaits mankind, and Malthus presented this theory received a lot of criticism, and Malthus was accused of depression and hatred of the poor. But were his prophecies right? Fortunately, she was completely wrong. Malthus fell into the trap of generalization. He applied the results of the limited data that was with him to the future of mankind. He also overlooked human action and history. Humans did not increase at the rates that Malthus mentioned, and resources increased thanks to human innovations. Malthus assumed that humans would continue their destructive approach until and with all the omens of doom ringing around them. David Ricardo is known to be the author of the most complex economic theories. Ricardo followed in the footsteps of Adam Smith, but he developed a more detailed theory, more annoying for politicians and large landlords, and all Ricardo's ideas revolved around how to use resources more effectively, where countries and individuals share business, as Adam Smith said. But this division should be according to the lowest opportunity cost. This means that countries should specialize only in products that make them sacrifice as few resources as possible. This meant that local merchants should be satisfied with the competition or transfer their trade to other areas that are already distinguished by the state. And here the war began between Ricardo and local merchants who demand to protect them from foreigners, while Ricardo believes that these short-sighted trends, such as taxation, will only lead the world back to trade isolation. But in return, if countries exchange their manufactured goods for raw materials that they lack, wealth will accumulate. John, confused between love and pleasure. Marx, a popular philosopher. This boy did not live through his childhood years, He had no friends at all, but instead, his father made him about a quarter of a century ahead of his generation with tons of books and knowledge. In the period when his peers were having fun here and there, John Stuart Mill was busy promoting Bantham's utilitarian theory that explains and subjects all human actions to pain and pleasure. This rational current achieved a vogue. But upon triumph, Mill realized that this feeling was not perfect. At a mature age, he wanted to love and made up for that corner that he missed in his childhood. And the current of Romanticism saved him from this drought. This all-embracing mind of rationality and Romanticism made John's views on the economy relative and ever-changing. He believed that the free market policy and the principle of non-interference of the state are necessary except in strategic tasks. Nevertheless, he wrote a lot about taxes and how to apply them and called for imposing them on noisy parties and similar extravagances. We can say that John was one of the most cautious and responsible economists, and therefore he is the most hesitant and taking intermediate positions. He wanted to grant a social subsidy to the poor, but he feared that those subsidies would make them less competitive and more neglected, and called for the imposition of taxes on extravagance, but he also recommended abolishing the escalating tax so that people would not be reluctant to invest and expand markets, views befitting a utilitarian philosopher belonging to Romanticism. From models to reality, fashion is an economic factor. It seems that the childhood of most economists was similar. Alfred Marshall did not differ much from John in his early years. Marshall's life began to be filled with language and dogma lessons, and his economic activity began at a time when the scientific community was emerging from the cloak of Newton's philosophy to embrace Darwinian philosophy and its evolutionary approach. Marshall was interested in the supply and demand process and tried to develop a specific theory describing their movement and the influence of producers and consumers in them. Marshall applied Darwin's theory to economics and noted that extreme changes and coups do not exist here, but what is happening behind the curtain, that the producer and the consumer are trying to adapt to the existing situation gradually. And on this Marshall applied the borderline theory: the consumer will determine his desire to buy according to the additional pleasure he will experience, and the product will continue to produce and supply based on the profit that will return to him. And from the intersection of the desire of the parties the price is determined, and with this law Marshall established the factor of flexibility as an important attribute of supply and demand processes, which is another name for the nature of consumers' reaction to the price of a product rising or falling. But is it marginal utility that controls only the purchase desire and affects the balance of supply and demand? Was Marshall right? Marshall's theory banished a lot of factors and established pleasure and utility as the main factor controlling supply and demand, and Thorstein Philbin attacked this trend, which assumes that humans have a constant reaction like machines, and their decisions are always made based on the result of measuring utility and price. Philbin explained that humans are not independent entities as assumed by economic models, but most often people decide to buy as an imitation of the society around them, and even some products acquire their marketing identity from the category they target. Thus, fashion trends and the social interface control the supply process. Philbin called this phenomenon show consumption, thereby positioning himself as the enemy of businessmen. He sees that companies and businessmen encourage and profit from this phenomenon, and by doing so they are fighting creators who are not so much interested in vogue as in development and innovation. And Philbin also could not resist the curiosity of the future. He predicted that the control of production by businessmen would cause an increase in show consumption, stimulate the instinct of simulation that sooner or later, undecided glances, the bewildering modern economy, Economists have long argued about Keynes' theory, and the monetarist school accused Keynes's followers of completely neglecting the impact of money. The government controls politicians sometimes and business people most of the time. The monetarist school was not the only one that had problems with Keynes' others precisely means. Still, the growing bother also opposed him in relation to government intervention. The school of the public option views politicians as merchants working in the gover, precisely meant nothing more, and thus they will not miss the first opportunity that comes to them to make profits. This is exactly what companies and labor unions that want to escape from market competition by government support, or by issuing monopolistic decisions under the pretext of preserving local industry or protecting society from incompetence, do not do these decisions, but they guarantee profit to these weak at the expense of consumers. You may wonder why business people succeed in lobbying the government and consumers are not succeeding. Because the citizens' quest to organize themselves and put pressure on the government is more expensive than what those companies plunder from each individual. So the followers of this school believe that all commercial activities favor government intervention and controls, not the other way around, because they protect them from the dangers of the free market and honest competition, and because they can use these controls, through lobbyists, to monopolize the market evaluation spurist. But if citizens neglect something like this, why do governments allow it? Followers of the public option school do not think well of anyone. As we assume the bad evolutions of politicians, government employees will also pursue interests use, inflating interests use. They cannot take bribes. Keynes so raising the budget of government departments is the only solution that enables them to increase their salaries and powers. Hence, countries with stable economies and bloated bureaucratic systems are the most susceptible to manipulation by government officials and are, therefore, the most subject to lobbyists and special interests. So what was Keynes doing by encouraging government activities and projects? He completely rejected this model and insisted that government officials pursue the public interest, whether of their own free will or no. Keynes believed that a hidden political factor forces politicians to follow the public interest. Still, Keynes did not realize that the influence of this hidden factor is greatly diminished by increasing government activities and subsidizing spending. Keynes lived with British politicians during the First World War. He thought that all government officials were as spectacular and moral as these, but the rest of the world sees that they were not. And finally, it was a long journey from Adam Smith in classical economics to Keynes in the modern era. We saw how economists treated models as a laboratory method, were deceived by their results, some dared to the future, and the result was the consensus of all economists that they are dealing strictly with science that does not guarantee this. Yes, in the end, the economy is based on logical foundations. But most of the actions of human beings are not. Perhaps when economists have the feelings of artists, the brains of politicians, and in the morality of reformers, we can talk about their vision of our future.